Okay, everybody, I think we'll get started now. There's still people filtering in, as we can see. It being 9 o'clock Eastern time, I think people are just getting their coffee and starting. So my name is Jeff Geipel, and I'm with Mining Shared Value and Engineers Without Borders, and we co-host with the World Bank the Extractives-led Local Economic Diversification Community of Practice, which is an online community and resource library of practitioners and resources when it comes to any sort of efforts at mining and oil and gas local content and efforts to economically diversify host economies. Obviously, with everything from COVID and the green transition, all these questions are more critical than ever. And I think that obviously the COVID pandemic has only heightened the need for governance and economic diversification in many host countries to take place. So we do tend to hold webinars sort of on one every two or so months. This is actually the first of a three-part series focused on the oil and gas sector. Really excited to have a high caliber panel today representing both industry and government, and hopefully we can find some lessons for host countries all around the world on how they can approach this important topic of decarbonizing the oil and gas sector at the same time that we can respect the needs and economic goals of host countries that are highly reliant on the jobs and revenue and income that comes from oil and gas production. So I'm going to hand it over quickly to Silvana Torda from the World Bank to give a bit of a high-level overview of this webinar in the context of the World Bank's work, and then I'm going to come back and introduce our speakers. So thanks to everybody for joining us today.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. As announced, I know that many of you really attend our events regularly, so that is kind of an old story for you, but for the new attendees, this webinar and this community of practice are part of a knowledge program that was launched by the World Bank in 2014, and the program focuses normally on local content or industrial policy, meaning guided policies to ensure that the localization of benefits from oil, gas and mining activities in the countries where those resources are located. The program itself has evolved over time. We started, in fact, from things like the definition of local content, different policies, different ways in which to develop a local supply base. Lately, we're focusing, of course, as probably everyone else, on greening the value chains and what that means for our extractive sectors, what the decarbonization means for our extractive sectors, and mainly for our member governments. This webinar, as Jeff was saying, is a three-part effort to better understand the implication of decarbonization on local value creation. We start with an overview of the critical steps that the industry and the regulators should take to guide decarbonization efforts. We will then focus, probably in a couple of months, right, Jeff, on the greening the value chain itself. What can local entrepreneurs actually do to participate in the sustainability and greening efforts? And the final webinar will be on the decommissioning and repurposing of oil and gas offshore facilities, being an extremely topical issue, particularly in an effort to phase out, if you wish, those marginal fields or fields that are higher emissions. And with that, I think we have a sufficient number of attendees for now, so let's not deter from the discussion, and I leave it to Jeff to moderate the rest of the event.
Great, thanks very much. And maybe just a few quick housekeeping notes. So obviously, please keep your microphone muted if you're not speaking, and the session is being recorded. So I'm really excited to introduce some practitioners who are really at the heart of this discussion and efforts to do just this in terms of helping economic diversification and economic goals of host countries, while proceeding with attempts to reduce the carbon footprint of the oil and gas sector. So we've got two representatives of the oil and gas sector itself, as well as three speakers representing a state government who can speak to their efforts at reducing carbon emissions and economic environmental footprints of the sector. So first, from Royal Dutch Shell, we've got Shantanu Chatterjee, who's going to speak on Shell's efforts. Then Anne-Catherine Boga from Equinor, who's a leading consultant for climate policy. And then, as I mentioned, from the state government, we've got the Colorado state government, Jeffrey Robbins, Julie Murphy, and Joel Miner to be speaking about some of their efforts. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Shantanu. We're going to do sort of one presentation and then a little mini Q&A just to kind of get some high-level questions out of the way, and then back to the rest of the presentations, and then we'll end with a wider Q&A. So please do keep putting questions in as in the chat and the Q&A function so that we can compile them, and then they will all be asked sort of during the Q&A. When we actually get to the Q&A, you know, there will be the option to unmute yourself and actually ask the question verbally, but if you want to get the questions down now, that would be great as well. So over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, and maybe even good evening to people, depending on where you are. My name is Shantanu Chatterjee, as Jeff said, and I'm from the Royal Dutch Shell company. And what I plan to do over the next probably 10 minutes or so is to talk a little bit about our climate targets that we have been announcing over the course of last few years and updated in February of this year, and then touch a little bit upon you know, how we see this the challenge of decarbonizing the oil and gas sector needs to be approached, and then open up for questions, as Jeff said. So next slide, please. That's a cautionary note. Right, our climate target. So our overarching target that we announced is that our target is to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050, as society makes progress towards achieving the goal of the UN Paris Agreement on climate change. So what do we cover in this target? We cover all our scope 1 and 2 emissions from our operations, and we cover all our scope 3 emissions from use of energy sold by Shell. But particularly, and this is in a way not necessarily unique, but the size of it is unique for Shell, that we are, of course, an integrated oil company, and what the oil and gas company, and what that means is that we produce a certain quantity of oil and gas, which we take out of the ground. We then refine, process, liquefy a certain volume, which is typically almost double the amount we produce ourselves. And by the time we sell finished products or energy carriers into the market, that is almost 4 times the amount that we take out of the ground ourselves in energy terms. And so therefore there is a very large amount of scope 3 emissions that we report and include in this target, which comes from products that we that are produced or processed by others, and we buy from them and sell. So for those ones, we cover the full life cycle emissions. So in simple terms, what that means is we cover the emissions from the use of those products, plus we cover the emissions that happened when those products were taken out of the ground or processed in refineries or gas plants. So that's because they are supposed to be reported under different categories of scope 3. So that's that's the total amount of emissions we cover in our target to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050. We believe that this total of scope 1, 2, and 3 from the energy products that we sell, that peaked in 2018, and that is around 1.7 gigatons per annum. And since then, that was the highest emission year, and since then it has been lower than that. And we plan to take it to zero by 2050. Next slide, please. In tracking the trajectory, because what is important in sort of being aligned with the goals of Paris is not just becoming net zero by 2050, and this applies to the whole world, not just Shell. Just having net zero emissions or not adding any further emissions to the stock in the atmosphere on a net basis by 2050, just that in itself is not enough. What is also equally important is the trajectory, because CO2 emissions are a stock problem. It's the cumulative emissions that are added which counts. So therefore, we have set interim targets to make sure that we are on a trajectory, we are on the right trajectory that is needed to be in line with Paris. So by 2023, we have a target to reduce the net carbon intensity of all energy that we sell by 6 to 8%. That's 20% by 2030, and by 2035, that's 45%. And of course, by 2050, we are net zero on both absolute as well as on a carbon intensity basis. Next slide, please. Right, what this slide shows are the type of things that we, as of today, we believe we will do and we will need to do in order to deliver on these targets. This is an illustrative slide, so the sizes of the bars do not indicate a plan that exists, but it is an illustration of the type of things and to what degree each one of them might contribute to the target. So some of these are purely, they help in reducing emissions. Some of these reduce emissions by substituting the energy that we sell. So, for example, we start with, of course, getting our own operations more efficient. So there is the operational efficiency piece, and within that is our announced target to keep methane emissions intensity below 0.2%. And then as we go towards the right, we have plans to move more and more away from oil towards gas, and then growing this gas share of our hydrocarbon production is expected to grow. And then comes the low carbon power business, which is going to play a significant role in achieving the targets. We believe that by 2030, for example, we'll be operating more than 2.5 million electrical vehicle charging points, or we'll be delivering equivalent to renewable electricity that can power more than 50 million households. And we are already quite a significant seller of electricity, and that business will likely continue to grow. Then there are levers such as low carbon fuels, biofuels, and hydrogen, and finally sinks, because all scenarios show that the energy system on its own cannot be zero simply by shifting from the legacy type of energy to the new zero carbon energy. The system will still have some residual emissions which will need to be stored by using engineered sinks such as CCS or natural sinks, which is taking help of nature to store away or to compensate for emissions in the energy system. So those are also part of our plans. Next slide, please. Right, and this is which we believe is probably the most important for us, which is working together with our customers sector by sector. And this is where I would like to spend a little bit of time, because when we look at the challenge of decarbonizing the oil and gas sector, it is important to frame the problem correctly and within the proper reference. What I mean by that is that as we talk about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, what do they stand for? Scope 1 and 2 are about operations. So that's about the activities that are to take oil or gas out of the ground, to transport it, to process it, and to turn it into an energy carrier. That then is sold by the oil and gas sector to end user sectors like transport, like the built environment, like heavy industry, and others. And it is when those products are used that scope 3 emissions take place. Now, when it comes to hydrocarbons, traditional hydrocarbons, the ratio between scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 emissions are typically around 15. So scope 1 and 2 emissions typically make up about 10 to 15% of the total emissions. The insight that gives us is that addressing scope 3 emissions is extremely important. Or in other words, we need to see this challenge as a value chain challenge. Decarbonizing the oil and gas sector, if it is defined as just reducing the operational emissions from the sector, that only addresses 15% of the problem. The 85% of the challenge is in the use of the energy. And what we need to do, not just as Shell, I would say society as a whole, is to look at what needs to happen so that use of energy is transformed. There are many discussions where people look at this and say, yeah, what we need to do is to move from, for example, producing oil and gas to production of renewable electricity. That is a very important step, and that must happen. However, that does not solve the problem. Why? Because if I look at myself as an individual, in my home, there is a gas stove which is used for cooking. In my home, there is a gas boiler which is used for heating the home. I drive a car that runs on gasoline. Now, whichever company I buy my energy from could build the largest renewable power generation plant next to my home, but that will not reduce the emissions from my energy use until I change the equipment in which I use the energy. So I need to change the car from a petrol engine car to an electric car. I need to change my heating system into a heating system that uses electricity instead of gas. I need to change my cook stove to an electric cook stove, and extending this to industry. Similar things need to happen in industry. Furnaces need to be changed from fuel oil fired furnaces to electric furnaces potentially, or equipment that uses other low or zero carbon form of energy. And what that needs is the sectors that supply energy into the market and sectors that use the energy, for these sectors to work together. And this needs to happen with also the active support of regulators and governments, by way of bringing in the right kind of policies that encourage this system transformation. Because the challenge is not just about changing the type of energy. What makes this energy transition in some ways unique is that it is genuinely an energy system transition challenge. We need to change the type of energy, and because we need to change the type of energy, therefore, the equipment in which that energy is used, the infrastructure that is used to send that energy to the end user, all of this needs to change. And that needs a value chain thinking, a value chain approach. And that's why we are on our part working with the sectors that we serve, getting into collaborations, getting into alliances with them to understand their transition plans, so that we can match our transition plans with them, and together we can turn this challenge into an opportunity. I think that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much. Really insightful analysis. I really appreciate all the value chain approach you're talking about, because I think there is, as you alluded to, perhaps sometimes too much of a focus only on the oil and gas production, when actually, of course, we're not going to solve that by only addressing that part of the value chain. So I'm going to quickly do a couple questions for you, just to kind of kick things off for you individually. One is, you talked about this, you mentioned the national policy intervention, in your diagram there. When you're speaking about all these kind of programs that you're trying to do, whether that be improving your own practices or improving the use of your products, what have you seen being the most effective, in an approach? I'm sure in some cases you've already got some governments who are doing some working with you on this, and in other cases that's just getting started. So I'd love to hear some initial insights on what's working and what will work.
I mean, you take, for example, if I pick some really specific examples, like the UK government announcing that, please pardon me if I get the date wrong, that after 2030, there would be a new registration of internal combustion engine vehicles of a certain category. Yes. What that kind of policy does is it creates a kind of timetable and a level of certainty which is needed, so that all the players that are involved, and this is a great example, because a great question, and allows me to use a great example. If you think about it, to eliminate emissions from the passenger transport sector, there needs to be cars that can use electricity. So those cars need to be produced by and sold by car manufacturers. There needs to be enough supply of electricity, and there need to be people who build the infrastructure charging these cars. And yeah, so I would pick that sort of thing as a very, very specific example. Of course, other significant announcements by many countries around the world of becoming net zero, their net zero aspirations, they are of course also very helpful at a macro level.
Mm-hmm. Great, helpful. We got a couple of questions that came in. Just a reminder to everybody in terms of the question process. There's going to be 3 options. You can put the Q&A in the chat, in the Q&A. You can also raise your hand, in which case then we can have you unmuted to be able to speak your question verbally when I call on you, and then we'll do it that way. So for now, I've got a couple of great questions that I think kind of I'll loop into one question, which is to say, focusing on your current operations. One is Francisco asked, is Shell looking at retrofitting offshore platforms to produce wind power, which I've seen a couple interesting cases of that around the world. And then another question is Shell planning to use renewable energy to power its own operations? Robert notes on the slide, the operational efficiency referred mostly to flaring and fugitive emissions only. So those 2 questions for your current operations.
Yeah, no, let me start. I mean, they are very similar questions in a way. Especially our Scope 2 emissions. A large part of that comes from the electricity that we purchase, and we are looking at options to move into purchasing renewable electricity. We are also looking at where it is more beneficial to do so, and where it makes more sense to do so, of setting up renewable power generation within our own facilities, or as they say, behind the meter. Yeah. And the same goes for use of renewable electricity on platforms, etc. There are quite a few projects which are being discussed by not just Shell, also consortiums of companies which are in that direction.
Fantastic. Great. Well, great to hear some of your initial ideas on that. And of course, there'll be more opportunity to ask questions about Shell's operation in the general Q&A. But for now, we're going to transition over to Anne-Catherine from consulting with Equinor. Can you bring up their slides there, Tatiana?
So sorry, they took away my sharing powers. So can Emma change again, please?
We'll get there.
Seems like it's as hard as the energy transition.
That's exactly. But I think we'll get the slides up, and maybe and Catherine, maybe you can start while we just get.
I will. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, and here we go with the slides as well. So thank you, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this webinar. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. So I'm Ann-Katrin Våge, and I work with the climate policies in Equinor's corporate sustainability unit. Equinor is a Norwegian energy company with global operations. And I will now present how Equinor sees our role in the energy transition and how we work in Equinor with the decarbonization of oil and gas. And as Jeff said, after my presentation, it's an opportunity then to raise questions and comments. So please add your question in the chat box or raise your hand. Could you take the next slide, please? Thank you. So on the 18th of May, the International Energy Agency launched a roadmap for how the energy sector can achieve net zero on a global basis by 2050. And the report describes the fundamental shift that is necessary to achieve net zero, with a series of measures that must be implemented, and that is shown in this figure. The transition will require technological development, massive energy efficiency measures, and a change in consumer behavior, as mentioned by Shantanu. The IEA report also describes the need for massive growth in renewables, hydrogen, and CCS. Equinor has a net zero by 2050 ambition and aims to become a leading company in the energy transition. So we are changing the company from being a focused oil and gas company to a broad energy company with considerable growth within renewable energy, CCS, and the hydrogen. And we see this as a business opportunity. And we are developing a portfolio that will create value also in the net zero future. So if you click, you will see the some boxes here. If you just click, oh, thank you. So in the next slides, I will go a bit more into detail on how Equinor plans to contribute to the energy transition and the measures here identified by IEA. So if you click one more, and then it's this gray one, yeah, thank you. So one thing that has got a lot of attention is that if the measures are implemented and with the scale needed, there is no need for new oil and gas fields. And the IEA is right. However, the premise is that we succeed with the energy transition at the scale required. And that's why it's so important that we all work on the measures that reduce emissions and the consumption of fossil fuels. And in that way, we can succeed with the energy transition. In the IEA scenario, the energy world looks completely different in 2050. Almost 90% of the electricity generation comes from renewable sources, and fossil fuels demand will fall from almost 4/5 of total energy supply today to 1/5 by 2050. And the fossil fuels will in 2050, according to IEA, be provided by a small number of low-cost producers. And the CO2 from the fossil fuels in 2050 must, if possible, be captured, stored, and the oil and gas must then be produced with near zero emissions, which includes near zero methane emissions, no flaring, and that the oil and gas production is powered by renewable energy. The IEA report highlights the fact that the expertise, the resources, and the experience in the oil and gas industry can play a significant role in achieving the energy transitions. And these are opportunities that Equinor intends to utilize. So I will show you how in the next slide. Thank you. So, as I said, Equinor is developing as a broad energy company, and we aim to become a global offshore wind major and expect an increase in our renewable investments to between 12 and 16 gigawatts installed capacity by 2035. That's around 30 times the current level. In the UK, we are currently operating 3 offshore wind farms, including the world's first floating wind farm, Hywind Scotland. And we are building the world's biggest offshore wind farm northeast of England, Dogger Bank. A 3.6 gigawatt project powering up to 6 million homes in the UK with renewable energy. We are in the US, and the Empire Wind project is located 15 to 30 miles southeast of Long Island, New York. and it will have a total installed capacity of 2.4 gigawatts. And in addition, we are in the US investing in the Beacon Wind projects outside New England. And the Baltic projects outside Poland are quite interesting. It will have a total capacity of 3 gigawatt, but they are among the first projects that are awarded the contracts for difference. And it will be an important part of Poland's ambitious offshore wind development plan and will be a game changer for Poland's energy transition. Shantanu got questions about powering oil and gas production with renewables. We are doing that with the Hywind Tampen wind farm. It will consist of 11 floating wind turbines based on a concept developed by Equinor, and the turbines will deliver energy to the Snorre and Gullfaks oil and gas platforms, which will be the first platforms in the world to receive power from floating offshore wind farm. And the project will reduce the CO2 emissions by more than 200,000 tons per year, and it's scheduled to start up at the end of 2022, not far away from now. The Johan Sverdrup oil field started up in 2019, powered with renewable energy from shore. In this way, Johan Sverdrup is producing oil with a CO2 intensity of 0.67 kilogram CO2 per barrel oil equivalent. 0.67, that's only 5% of the global industry average. So from 2022, the cable with renewable electricity from shore to Johan Sverdrup will be extended to nearby fields. And this will reduce the CO2 emissions by 1.2 million tons additionally. And in this way, we are taking the emissions from the oil and gas production to near zero. So if you go to the next slide. On this slide, we have an overview of Equinor's major hydrogen and CCS projects. In the Northern Lights project in Norway, we will store CO2 from heavy industry in subsea formations outside the coast of Norway. In the UK and in the Netherlands, we are heavily involved in scaling up CCS and hydrogen for the Humber and Teesside industry clusters and for the H2 Magnum projects. For many years, we have been developing technology for electric ships, and we are now looking into how we can provide liquid hydrogen to ships. And we are working with hydrogen solutions for heavy industry as steel production. So this is just some examples. So the next slide is the last slide. Thank you. So our offshore oil and gas experience and competence give us a huge advantage in the development of offshore wind, and in particular, the floating wind turbines. The know-how is highly transferable, and in the picture to the left, you see the Aasta Hansteen gas floating platform, and to the right, you see the Hywind Scotland floating wind turbines, and you clearly see the similarities. Before I open up for questions and comments, I want to highlight that, as IEA also is pointing to, net zero will not be achieved without cooperation. Scaling of the energy transition to meet net zero by 2050 is dependent on a global and binding cooperation between the authorities, industry, and the consumers. And by that, I will thank you for your attention and welcome questions and comments.
Great, thanks very much. Like I said, just a reminder, you can put your hand up and I can call on you for a question. Right now, we've got a few questions that have already bubbled up, but a few that we've already set aside. I really like your point about cooperation. Your plan is for the next 5 years, stepping up your investment in CCS and transport and the building of the hydrogen market. These are obviously going to require big cooperation across industries. So what would you say are the main challenges for this vision of cross-sector cooperation for this reality?
So, as you said, to succeed, we are dependent on the cooperation. And Equinor, we work with 11 other oil and gas companies in the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, where we are working with reducing the emissions and developing CCS. And we also have the $1 billion OGCI Climate Investment Fund that invests in technologies and projects to accelerate the decarbonization of oil and gas. I think that is of huge importance. For the CCS, we work very closely with the heavy industry and power plants, and we work for them to capture the CO2 from their processes and cool the CO2 to liquid phase. And when it's cool to liquid phase, then Equinor is taking care of the CO2. We come and get it by a ship, we transport it and store it at subsea formations. So that's an example of how we work with the industry on CCS. On hydrogen, I think it's particularly important that we work with the industry clusters in order to scale up the production and the use of hydrogen, because I think scaling is a challenge when it comes to hydrogen.
Great. And then, a linked question, which is that obviously requires a lot of coordination, and you're speaking a lot about your goals in Norway to reduce emissions in the most detail. When you're working in other countries, and perhaps a developing country, for example, how replicable are these initiatives? And you don't have to speak only to your own efforts, but also, more widely, how can the oil and gas sector focus on some of the same initiatives you're doing, but in a more challenging context where you don't have, a government as perhaps progressive and as well resourced as, say, the Norwegian government? What would you say? How can this be replicable in developing countries?
A good question. Well, I will try to answer that. Well, the Equinor's net zero by 2050 ambition is a corporate-wide ambition, and it covers the whole company, but most of our operations are in Norway. And we have come a long way, as you say, with reducing the emissions in Norway. But we are then building on our experiences and learnings from Norway when we then do also these reduction measures in other countries. But clearly there are regional market and regulatory differences. As an example, Norway has a very high CO2 tax for emissions related to the oil and gas production, currently around $65 per ton, and that comes in addition to the ETS allowances costs. But when we see now that the carbon pricing is introduced in more and more regions, we will see that the reduction projects also will be profitable in those regions, as we have seen in Norway, when we have had the CO2 tax since 1992, and we are now on a level that is of the regions in the world with the lowest carbon footprint due to the CO2 tax. But we see now the development of the carbon pricing around the world, and I think that's a very promising development that will deliver results.
Great. That actually anticipates one of the questions we had from Francisco asking about the need for carbon pricing. So really fantastic that you addressed that ahead of time. I'm going to transit over to Colorado now. I think it would be good to get their perspective from a host country government standpoint. And then, like I said, we'll have the opportunity to have a more open Q&A for some of the other questions I'm seeing in the chat. So could Tatiana, could you hand over the sharing to our colleagues, and then we look forward to hearing your inputs.
Good morning, and thanks everyone for your time. This morning, my name is Julie Murphy. I'm the director of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. With me today are Joel Miner, who's one of our lawyers and has been really instrumental in integrating regulatory changes in Colorado related to reducing emissions on the upstream side. Also with us is Jeff Robbins, who's chair of the commission and has helped shape and set the policy that Colorado has been implementing over the last 2 years. Next slide, please. I think as I reflect on the presentations that have already occurred this morning, those are very global, and so I want to take us down to the very, very local. Here, for context, is where Colorado is located within the United States. We're a relatively small state. Next slide, please. But we have a number of oil and gas producing basins. In the western half of the state, we are largely a gas production play. There's the Piceance Basin, Raton Basin, and San Juan basins. On the eastern plains, which is also where the majority of our population growth is occurring, is a mostly oil field, unconventional resource that's being developed unconventionally currently. Again, this is where we have this intersection of increasing oil and gas development complemented by increasing population, which has really led Colorado to looking hard at how and whether to develop oil and gas in proximity to people in particular, and how to do that by reducing the environmental footprint. Next slide, please. Again, this is a map of what I've just covered, kind of describing where that location is. And if you'll focus on the Denver-Julesburg Basin in particular, that's where our oil production is and also where our population growth is occurring. Historically, the majority of Colorado's gas production has been, again, on the western half or southern portions of the state. As we've seen increasing oil production in that Denver-Julesburg Basin, again, that's where we started to also see large amounts of gas production. And next slide, please, Joel. Again, Colorado is a top 10 producer of both oil and gas. That gas production has been augmented in recent years with operators being required to collect and get gas into the pipeline that would have otherwise been vented or flared in the DJ Basin with the oil production. Next slide, please. So what is Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, and what do we do? We oversee the regulatory environment for oil and gas development in Colorado. Right now, we have 5 full-time commissioners that oversee the policy setting and making decisions as it relates to particular enforcement actions or changing the policy. We are staffed with 140 full-time employees that focus by discipline on environmental protection, permitting, engineering, etc. Next slide, please. Again, we're really focused on the hyper-local of what Colorado does and has done. Of course, we are a large producer of oil and gas within the United States, but we share that jurisdiction with a number of different other local governmental entities. What we've highlighted here is that we share a lot of authority with the Colorado Air Quality Control Commission that really focuses on that intersection of emissions. And so a lot of the work that we're talking about today has been in concert with or perhaps led by the Colorado Air Quality Control Commission. We also have authority for shared authority with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and local governments. Next slide, please. And with that, I will hand it over to Mr. Miner.
Thank you, Director Murphy. This slide shows a timeline of Colorado's legislative and regulatory efforts to decarbonize the oil and gas sector. In 2008, COGCC adopted new regulations to better protect the environment. Among other things, these rules required reporting and COGCC approval of venting and flaring. COGCC also adopted emission reduction standards for certain types of equipment, required green completions to minimize emissions, as well as odors. In 2014, the Air Quality Control Commission, or AQCC for short, as Director Murphy mentioned, adopted the first ever direct methane regulations in the United States, along with numerous equipment emission standards. It also adopted the first leak detection and repair, or LDAR, standards that were applicable to the upstream oil and gas sector in the United States. The AQCC then strengthened its regulations in 2017 by requiring more frequent LDAR and adopting new and stronger emissions regulations for compressors, as well as pneumatic pumps and controllers. The pace of Colorado's efforts to decarbonize the oil and gas sector accelerated in 2019 when the Colorado legislature adopted 2 new laws. First, House Bill 19-1261 set greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets and charged the state government with creating a roadmap for achieving those targets. Director Murphy will discuss that more in a few moments, but for now I will just note Colorado's emission reductions targets, which are on the screen, and you can read them for yourself. In 2019, the Colorado legislature also adopted another law, Senate Bill 19-181, which is the most important one for COGCC. It changed the agency's mission to prioritize protection of public health and the environment. In recent years, the Air Quality Control Commission has adopted several regulations to implement the new laws. These include rules for the transmission or midstream sector, an annual emissions reporting inventory, emission standards for disposal wells, requiring flowback vessels to be enclosed, on-site engine emission standards, as well as net zero emission pneumatic devices. We only have a very limited time, so that was a very high-level overview of the Air Quality Control Commission's regulations, but there is more information about those regulations on the IEA's website, as well as the Air Quality Control Commission's Oil and Gas Information page. Turning now to the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, or COGCC's, efforts to implement Senate Bill 19-181, I wanted to quickly highlight the critical role of partnerships between industry as well as other stakeholders and how that has allowed COGCC to develop the new regulations. COGCC facilitated a collaborative stakeholder process over the course of a year and a half. COGCC worked with industry, NGOs, local governments, and the AQCC to develop regulations that are not only highly protective, but also possible for industry to comply with. COGCC was able to accomplish its rulemaking objectives because representatives from all these stakeholder groups were willing to work together. I'll now turn to some more specific details about the regulations that COGCC adopted, and first I want to talk about why COGCC adopted them. First, COGCC has a mandate to prevent the waste of natural gas. COGCC is subject to the Colorado law, and those statutes in Colorado define the waste of natural gas to include the escape of natural gas into the air. So when gas is vented or flared, it is considered a waste because the gas is not put to beneficial use. COGCC's regulations are intended to ensure that natural gas that is removed from the ground is put to some kind of beneficial use. Senate Bill 19-181 also directs COGCC to regulate emissions to protect and minimize impacts to public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. Because natural gas consists of a variety of hydrocarbons that may pose health risks to people living in close proximity to oil and gas development, it may pose safety risks, some cause odors that are a nuisance to people living nearby, and others harm the environment by contributing to climate change or air pollution. I'll now provide a more detailed overview of the specific rules that COGCC adopted in late 2020 as part of its mission change rulemaking. First, COGCC prohibited venting and flaring. Venting is defined as intentionally allowing natural gas to escape into the air, and flaring is defined as the combustion of natural gas for a reason other than using it in an on-site process. COGCC prohibited these activities because they are considered waste and have adverse impacts on public health, safety, welfare, and the environment, as I mentioned on the previous slide. Although COGCC prohibited venting and flaring, it recognized that there are situations where each activity may be necessary. So COGCC codified a list of exceptions, as well as other standards to facilitate compliance and enforcement. First, COGCC required oil and gas operators to provide notice of venting and flaring that will occur to local emergency response agencies. This ensures that they can appropriately respond to calls from the public who are concerned about seeing flames at oil and gas locations. Second, COGCC adopted standards for venting and flaring during drilling operations. Third, COGCC adopted standards for venting and flaring during completion operations, and I'm happy to take questions about those later. I'll skip the details about them for now because we're a little short on time. Fourth, COGCC prohibited venting and flaring during the production phase with only 5 limited exceptions, which include upset conditions, maintenance activities, if an operator obtains COGCC's prior approval through a gas capture plan, during annular pressure tests, and during well liquids unloading. COGCC recognized that numerous existing wells were already venting and flaring during production, and so the agency gave operators of those existing wells a 1-year grace period to come into compliance. During that year, operators must submit a gas capture plan to show how they will either connect to a pipeline or find some alternative way to put the gas to beneficial use. If operators are still unable to comply after a year, they must file a formal application for a variance from the Commission that shows that they will have no net adverse impact on public health, safety, welfare, or the environment if they continue venting or flaring. Finally, COGCC required operators to submit gas capture plans as part of their new permit applications. Gas capture plans must include information about nearby pipelines and other alternatives for putting natural gas to a beneficial use. Those alternative beneficial uses can include everything from using the gas on site to power an engine or to generate electricity. And there's even an innovative company in Colorado that is working with operators to use natural gas that is captured on site to power server farms. COGCC then verifies compliance with an operator's gas capture plan after a well is drilled, and if the operator does not comply, COGCC can order the operator to shut in the well until it connects to a pipeline or otherwise puts the gas to beneficial use. During the mission change rulemaking, COGCC also adopted new rules to address cumulative climate impacts. As part of their permit applications, operators must submit estimates of incremental increases or decreases in emissions associated with their proposed operations. Over time, this information will populate a database called the Cumulative Impacts Data Evaluation Repository, or CIDR for short. As part of their permit applications, operators must also submit a cumulative impacts plan explaining how they will avoid, minimize, and mitigate cumulative climate impacts. And finally, to provide a big picture review of cumulative climate impacts, once a year, COGCC staff, so Director Murphy, must report to the Commission, Chair Robbins, about the progress that is being made towards climate and cumulative impact goals. This report includes emissions data recorded in the CIDR database, data from the Air Quality Control Commission's emissions inventory, a report on progress towards Colorado's greenhouse gas reduction goals, and information on innovative new technologies, as well as recommendations for future actions. And with that, I will turn it back to Director Murphy for our last few slides.
Thank you, Joel. As Joel noted, we were going to touch briefly on the Colorado greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap. Again, this is something that is prepared by one of our related agencies in Colorado, but I think the piece that I want folks to take away is that Colorado is really at the intersection of establishing what numbers are, what deliverables are, and how we are going to achieve the goals set out by House Bill 1261. Next slide, please. One of the other pieces that I find particularly interesting that I've been watching is Colorado has evolved its regulatory requirements around oil and gas to make them less environmentally impactful, is wondering when and whether there will be some sort of market level response. And I think that with Colorado's established climate goals, we are now starting to see the opportunity for Colorado's oil and gas producers to take advantage of not take advantage of, but to be recognized for the work that they've done to decarbonize or eliminate environmental impacts. And so just recently, and here are a couple of headlines, we're starting to see that oil and gas companies can start to, again, sell their resources to folks who are looking for a less carbon intensive form of oil and gas development. And I'll be curious to watch how this continues to evolve. And again, this is the very, very localized view of how we can evolve an oil and gas regulatory regime to accomplish a number of goals as we think about climate initiatives as well. Next slide, please. And so we do want to acknowledge that we borrowed a number of images from other sources and wanted to put that in the slides in case anybody wants to follow up with those folks directly. I think we're a little bit long on time, but hopefully we can turn it over to questions.
Hey, thanks very much. Really appreciate the overview. It's quite thorough, as you say, going through both mechanics, but also sort of the back end policy context. I'll do one question here, but before we get to, I think we should open up the wider Q&A, but you know, in terms of these various efforts that you've put into place, what kind of regulatory effectiveness analysis have you carried out so far? And maybe at this early stage, what measures have you considered the most effective in reaching reduction targets?
I think that's a great question, Jeff. And to be perfectly candid, we haven't started to really quantify that, and that's part of what the ongoing work around the greenhouse gas roadmap is. I think that that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch. We intuitively know that by eliminating routine flaring, by enclosing vessels, by requiring intensive integrity requirements for all types of production facilities in our wellheads, that we've had an impact, but I'm not sure that we've done the best job of making sure we knew what the starting point was and then what the outcome was. So I think we're going to be trying to do some backwards looking work in that arena to document how we've improved it. And I mean, I know industry has been collecting data around that. And so we're trying to think about how do we engage either a consultant or some sort of probably an academic maybe to kind of do that back end look and understand what we've done. And then also the important piece is always to look at where we need to go next and what else we can do. We have a very focused mission in terms of the upstream oil and gas development. And so understanding how our work partners with the midstream regulators, whether they're federal or local or state and into kind of that broader supply chain is a place where I think we're going to continue to get to work in Colorado.
Mm-hmm. And maybe a linked question, certainly you want to have your own expertise, take a look at this, but where else might you look in terms of the federal government, other states? Are there other models you can look at for determining the effectiveness of these approaches?
I think that's a great question, and it's something that I will take back. We have in the United States, we have something called the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, and it's an association of oil and gas regulators, and it also includes some of our Canadian counterparts. And I think that might be a great topic to understand what they've done to understand this intensity. I think that we as an organization have been so focused on reducing impacts. And I think a number of our counterparts have as well, that maybe now it's time to take that collective look back and see if they've done the same. So thanks for the suggestion by your question.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's a great idea. And I mean, that's obviously one of the things we're trying to do with this community practice is that not everyone has to recreate the wheel. But that's really exciting that you already have that kind of system in place in the United States and some Canadian counterparts that, other countries could look at. And creating some kind of forum that regularly shares information would be a way for no one has to recreate the wheel every single time. So that's very exciting to hear about that. We had a question from Francisco, who's asking, considering the large resources of natural gas, is Colorado looking at that as a major plank in the strategy?
I'm sorry, Jeff, I didn't quite understand the question. I might have missed it.
Francisco asks, is Colorado considering is Colorado considering the large resources of natural gas promoting the low hydrogen market? The low hydrogen market.
I don't know that I've been terribly informed on the hydrogen side. We've been so focused on oil and gas regulation. I know that it's an evolving conversation, and a number of our legislative initiatives and our counterparts in the Colorado Energy Office are looking at different ways to transition, different models, and how that can work. So I could follow up separately with Francisco with more information perhaps, or connect him to the right folks if that would be helpful.
Great, fantastic. Okay, I think we should do that because we got about 20 minutes left. So we'd like to have a bit of time for Savannah to kind of recap things. I'd like to open it up to everybody. There's a few more questions I see here in the chat that are kind of for Shell and for others that have already spoken. But at this point now, as a reminder, you can put up your hand and we can have you unmute. But also, it would be great if you could put questions in directly into the chat now that could be kind of addressed to any speaker or all speakers. I'll just wait a minute for anyone to do that immediately, but there are a few questions that have come up. I'll just open up here. This is I think a very good question that came from Harshit Agrawal, who asked, and it's for Shell, but I think we can ask this. This is I think equally applicable everywhere, which is to say that in some cases we're seeing international oil companies, in order to achieve net zero, choose to divest carbon intensive assets, but this may just lead to the management of those carbon intensive assets by smaller oil companies or national oil companies, and there is a risk that will just transfer the difficult problem elsewhere. So I'd be really interested to hear the thoughts of perhaps both the oil companies present about what is this, how do we achieve this, your efforts to divest from really carbon intensive assets that don't just lead to them being run by another company.
Well, should I start on that?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, really great question. It is. And I think it's really shows that we need to focus on the demand. So the question is, should we focus on the supply side or demand side? when you focus on the supply side, we don't know the consequences as you are alluding to. But if we focus on the demand side and actually reduce the demand for the fossil fuels, reduce the demand that will ensure that we will have lower emissions of greenhouse gases, then we will have some effect, and we will for sure when there's no demand, you will not have any supply. So yes, very good question, as I think that it clearly shows that we need to focus on the demand and all the good measures to reduce the demand, and then the supply also will be reduced.
Great. Do you have any thoughts, Shannon, on that one?
I think that the answer Anne Catherine gave is absolutely great. I'll just build on it and say, you know, that is one of the key points about you know, how you approach decarbonization of oil and gas. You know, which end do you start from? Because he correctly said that if you just sort of if policy was designed to encourage people to get rid of their operational emissions, then all that is going to happen. You have seen many examples of that. You know, either operations in the past have tended to move across geographical boundaries to take advantage of, if I may call it, regulatory arbitrage, or you know, corporate boundary changes, etc. Which you know, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and others also recognize that, which does not really result in any real benefit for society. But so if you do not fundamentally change the energy system, then these kinds of problems will crop up. It's a great question, by the way.
Jeff, may I offer a little bit from the regulator's perspective? Thank you. I think it's a wonderful question. And one of the really important components of Colorado's regulatory requirements is that it levels the playing field, right? So it doesn't matter who owns it. We expect the operator to operate it in compliance with our expectations. And I recognize, again, we have a pretty localized focus. At the same time, the other piece that Colorado is starting to look very closely at is transfers of assets. And what can we as a policymaker do to prevent transfers to an operator who may not be able to comply with Colorado's regulatory expectations, and instead look at plugging, decommissioning, or retiring that asset, especially if it's at the end of its life. And so I think those are big picture questions, and making sure that we develop a regulatory regime that accomplishes the ultimate goals, as the previous speakers have noted, can help. But I, again, recognize that this is a place where I think Shantanu in particular hit on the importance of international cooperation and kind of level setting around these expectations can help prevent or preclude some of the concerns that the question raises.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, I think it's really, I mean, it's a fantastic question. And I think it speaks to this whole value chain necessity. And I always bring up an example, not specifically on emissions, but, you know, we work a lot with obviously Canadian companies, and there's been a couple of high profile cases where essentially Canadian companies have been forced to leave a couple of countries, one in Eritrea and one in Sudan, and of course the result was just that the Canadian company left, and that asset is now being run by a company from another country. So it doesn't, you know, it's not really solving the issue. So I think it speaks to a very large collective action problem that we all have in facing. So I got a couple more. Again, you can keep typing your questions into the chat. I've got one question here that's been kind of prepared in terms of how can we make sure that public policies that support the energy transition, and we've been speaking into a number of those ideas in carbon pricing and all those ideas, how can we ensure those policies also meet the economic development objectives of resource-dependent countries, right? So we've been focusing heavily in this discussion on sort of reducing the emission side of things, but I suppose we haven't talked as much about what does that mean for the host country suppliers, for example, and host country labor. Some of these technologies might be out of reach for, you know, local suppliers and local skilled technicians. So what can we do to make sure that these policies, which are designed to reduce carbon emissions during extraction and use, also support host country economic desires?
this is again a fantastic question, but I have to admit, first and foremost, I have to start by saying this isn't my area of expertise, because what this is touching upon is actually much bigger than a company issue. It's about how does one approach globally the issue of changed dynamics of sort of supply and trading and because on one type of energy system that exists, there are producer countries and consumer countries. When the world moves to a different kind of energy production, that dynamics may very well change, and that brings up questions like this. And to that, you have to also add, again, on which there are many others on this call who are much better experts than I am. Issues of equity, issues of adaptation, and how that is paid for. I think that is where the international cooperation again becomes extremely important. Also, which is recognized in the Paris Agreement, and various parts of the Paris Agreement are designed to sort of to address them, and one would hope that as understanding of this topic and the subject matures, and as the in the successive sort of COPs meetings, these issues are discussed, more and more practical answers to these will come up.
Any thoughts from Colorado and Catherine?
Yes, I just also want to add the carbon pricing, because the proper carbon pricing here is so crucial, and emitting CO2 must come with a cost. And we see that in more and more regions around the world. And of course, that is also an income for the state. As in Norway, we have the CO2 tax, as I mentioned, and the ETS allowances, and a total price of $80 per ton. It's really a huge income for the state. But even though with the carbon price of $80 per ton, we are competitive. And I think that clearly shows that both carbon price works, but and also that we as an industry can handle this high costs, and I think we have to be prepared to handle these high costs in all regions in the world going forward.
Great. I can, Julie, if anything to add? If not,
go ahead. It's up to you.
No, well, we got 10 minutes. Let's just do a couple more questions. So Zachary Spencer asked, do Shell and Equinor see building climate resilience in host communities as part of their climate strategy? And if so, what do these efforts look like?
You want to go first, Shantanu?
No, you go first, please.
No, I don't have any good good comment to that. Let me think a while you're speaking to it, Shantanu.
Yeah, what I'll say is, this is again an area of where I'll say we have a lot to learn. In Shell, we have been looking at this issue of climate resilience. Now, climate resilience can be, you can have a very broad definition of it, depending on which perspective you're looking from. Are you looking at it from the perspective of overall business dynamics of an oil and gas company? Then the climate resilience may mean a different thing. But for the purpose of answering this question, I'm going to use the definition that we're talking about. How do we become resilient to the physical impact of climate change? Because even with well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, some amount of physical climate change and its and impacts related to that are predicted. So I'll say that we started by looking at what impact, how that it might impact our own operations assets. But as soon as you do that, of course, what you realize is that your assets and operations are not we're not operating in a vacuum, of course. Yes, so we operate within environments where we have to depend on various facilities, various infrastructures for our supply chains to work, for our people who work in our facilities. They have to be in environments where they can continue to live, which is sort of referred to as outside the fence, if you like, impact. And we are we're starting to understand these various issues. There are a few interesting projects that we are part of around the world. Yeah, I'll just say that I don't think we have enough time to talk about it in the level of detail that's needed. But yes, it is something we do recognize as needed.
So for Equinor, I just want to add that. So I understood the question on climate resilience, and that can also be physical resilience. It can also be financial resilience for the energy transition. And that is two different questions, of course. But Equinor, we have oil and gas operations in Norway, UK, Denmark, US, and Brazil. And it's, of course, very different countries to operate in, with the different regulatory regimes and different political situations in the countries as well. But for the financial resilience, we are doing a stress test of all our projects in all the countries, and we use $100 per ton for all the countries, and the projects must be profitable with $100 per ton. And I think that's important now going forward, that for the financial resilience, that we all do this kind of stress test to make sure that we just implement the best projects that can be robust also in a high cost environment, because in the energy transition, production of oil and gas will be a high cost.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's really right. The idea of a stress test is really interesting, and I have one more question here that I think we can kind of link to this and maybe wrap up the questions this way. Our colleagues from Senegal asked, how do we smoothly manage at the regulatory level the socioeconomic impacts of such transition? So we've talked about the stress test for whether the project should go forward even at a certain price. But when it comes to, let's be honest, lost jobs at the local level, whether that be direct jobs or supply chain jobs, what are the options for governments to smooth that transition? Does it look like social welfare programs? Does it look like retraining? What are some of the options that governments have to smooth this transition when it means that ultimately some of these projects are no longer economic?
Jeff, I may jump in.
Yeah, great.
So Colorado has faced this issue, but more on the coal side. And we have recently created an Office of Just Transition at the state level to work with those communities affected by the Colorado's fairly swift transition away from developing and consuming coal within the state to generate electricity. I think that there's a lot of interest in and questions about whether the scope of that office should be expanding into the oil and gas sector for all of the reasons that you've identified. Obviously, it requires a commitment from the government to fund or otherwise oversee it. I think that retraining, understanding what other economic opportunities are available at that super local level. You know, in Colorado, we have a lot of tourism in the West, and can we start to supplement what was lost on one side with tourism? I know that in the eastern part of the U.S., coal communities have looked at retraining affected coal workers with different programs and projects. I think some of the challenge that we see, at least, or that I've seen in my prior work was in mining, is around identity, and people identify with a particular sector or doing a particular job. And it's more than just here's a boot camp of new skills. It's how does this become incorporated into your personal ideology? And those are really interesting and challenging social aspects to work with, but I think we can work on those things. And if anybody can hear my 2-year-old in the background, I'm really sorry. It's early in Colorado still, so
no worries at all. No worries at all. Shantanu and Catherine?
Yeah, I just want to add also that there's a lot of experience in the oil and gas industry today that we can build on. We have seen this in developing the offshore wind turbines, that we actually use the competence we have from the oil and gas production and all the constructions that we have been working with now for more than 50 years. And adding on and building on that experience is a huge opportunity, and I think it's really something that we need in the energy transition, to build on what we have today, also competence-wise.
I think most of the things have been already covered. To this, I'll add that, you know, the oil and gas industry has the engineering capability, the knowledge. Also, it has project management skills. It has the experience of putting together large projects at times that involves multiple jurisdictions, etc. as well. And many of the challenges in the new energy space could benefit from such things.
Fantastic. I think that's a great way to wrap up the Q&A with, you know, linking our work very focused on economic diversification with this carbon transition point. So Silvana, over to you. We've got about 4 minutes. I'd love to hear a bit of a wrap up on your side before some logistical notes on my part.
Thanks very much, Jeff. 4 minutes ain't a lot for the very rich discussion that we had. I'm glad that, in fact, we had so many interventions. So I will try to do my best to wrap up, but as usual, we will provide a briefing of the webinar, which will be posted on the community of practice. And at the end of the 3 sequence webinar, we will also provide a briefing note for policymakers. So from the entire discussion, what really emerged very clearly is if you will, a very challenging thought that diversification of our energy systems is actually a shared responsibility. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not the companies, it's not the regulators that are the main determinant of success. Is actually the entire society, because it requires both the technological changes, profound changes in the way we conceive, we produce, and we use energy, and the willingness to change our habits as consumers. So it's in order for, if you wish, the path to net zero vision of the IEA or any alternative path to that, to really come to reality, all these parts needs to fall into place. We talk about whether demand side or supply side intervention might be more effective in guiding this common path towards net zero. It seems from our participants, our discussants, that demand side are actually prominent, probably, and that's my own comment, probably because that's what we have done so far. But clearly, carbon prices, we talked about carbon pricing, the price of carbon to be put as high enough to actually create a change in approach. We talked briefly about ETSs, the trading schemes that are actually not been used that much for the oil and gas industry because most of the trading schemes exclude several types of potential projects, and perhaps that's why we're hearing about the emergence of alternative ETS schemes, which will be discussed probably in the next webinar. We talked about regulation as a way to level the playing field, and I think that was a very interesting point that was made by our colleagues in Colorado. In fact, the more we move towards decarbonization, the more, if you wish, the more responsible and visible companies move along this path, the more there is a risk that less responsible investors might step into this area. So one way to prevent, if you wish, or address this risk is to create regulatory standards, possibly an international standards that would lead everyone in the same direction. We also talked about how to smooth the transition away from oil and gas to a broader and more renewable energy base. That was obviously is a concern, mostly from governments that depend on oil and gas resources. And there was interesting observation made on, well, first of all, experience that we can draw upon, from example, the coal miner transition, so a just transition for all. By the way, there is a large initiative of this kind led by the European Union on coal transition that has a lot of case studies and a lot of literature and examples we could learn from. There is also the issue of competencies of the oil and gas industry that can actually be used to broaden the economies on resource-dependent countries. I think Shell made a reference to engineering competence, project management competencies. I would add to that fluid management skills, since water would be also one of the stressors of climate change. And what has actually emerged from the conversation, for me at least, is that many of these changes that are occurring, and I think Equinor did a very compelling case in explaining their strategy and how it is actually linked to technologies that have matured in the course of years within the company itself, some of them, and broader industry. It actually comes to my mind that the challenge for developing countries might actually lie in their access to technology, their ability to really roll out these initiatives, and also access to a market that can integrate low carbon fuels, new energy systems. So probably for developing countries, there is a mixture of international cooperation, if you wish, where the demand is going, but surely how to grow a local demand and how to finance it, access to finance, together with access to skills and technology would probably be an important driver of the way they adjust to the path that is being led now by more developed countries. I would say that this is a good segue to our next webinar, which will be in fact on integrating into the local value chain this energy transition. So there, I think it will be a better setting, a more detailed setting on how we can roll out this policy and the pace at which that could take in developing countries in particular. And with this, I hope I did justice to the very rich discussion. It's not an easy task, but I hope it worked. And again, I'm very happy about the discussion that happened and the very high participation from our audience.
Great. Thanks very much, Savannah, for wrapping it up. Just really quickly, I did put in the chat there to all attendees the email addresses. If you're not already a member of the ELLED community of practice, you can email myself or Kyla DeWert. So there's the email. So you'll be up to date on the next webinar as well. Again, it was a really, really great one to kick off this three-part series, and I learned a lot myself. So thanks everybody for attending, and thanks to our speakers. It was a really great discussion. And now.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye to everyone.